This house regret the popularity of mental health awareness content on TikTok. Example, 6 signs you have ADHD, my experience with depression, doctor explains. I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister, the first speaker of the proposition.
The biggest and only benefit opposition can get under their side of the house is the seemingly closure that social media provides them. In my speech, I'm going to prove to you why one, this closure is something that's ineffective in the first place, but two, why the existence of the popularity of these contents on social media is inherently harmful, so proud to propose. Two things I'm going to do in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to give a few pieces of framing on one, who the targets of these contents are, but two, on are counterfactual. And then I'm going to give two arguments, one on why it causes active harms to the teenagers, but two on why the glorification that oftentimes exists under the popularity is harmful. So then onto my first piece of framing on the targets of these kind of contents. One, I think, is largely directed towards teenagers who are still grappling with their identity, right? So for example, because these contents oftentimes exist on TikTok, we believe that oftentimes it is the teenagers who are the ones that go onto TikTok. But secondly, we say that this is extremely harmful because teenagers are still in a stage of development. They're still grappling with their identity. They oftentimes doubt themselves. When they actively see these kind of contents, it often causes a type of doubt in themselves, and they oftentimes are largely influenced by these kind of content. But secondly, then on my counterfactual, I think under our set of house, the counterfactual is that we're going to have more formal content that is more legitimate, right? The reason why this is exclusive to under our set of house is because without the popularity, the kind of content that is left is oftentimes contents like the doctors telling me about the real diagnosis, and also contents from newspapers that tell you about the harms of these kind of mental health issues. So then ultimately, before moving on, yes.
Why would the teenager population or the demographic be looking towards newspapers when most of them are looking on TikTok and get most of their information from TikTok?
This is exactly the reason why we read the popularity, right? Because with the popularity, people oftentimes go towards social media content, and this is the reason why they get a lot of misinformation, because oftentimes to attract popularity, you have a lot of generalizations and exaggerations. This is the reason why under your set house, they do not look to the legitimate and formal content, which is why it causes more harm to these teenagers. So then onto my first argument of why under opposition they cause active harm to teenagers. I think firstly I'm going to frame what these kind of awareness contents look like. One, I think is oftentimes people who share their experiences with their mental health issues. Right? So for example, is a day in my depressed life, but oftentimes it also happens having glorification of these mental health problems. So for example, it also looks like you're telling people that maybe some successful people also have mental health issues. It's okay to be it's okay for you to be depressed, but also things like telling you that ADHD people are smarter. But thirdly, I think it's also common harms and symptoms that you tell these people, right? For example, you give people maybe 6 signs that you have depression and things like that. But then why is this harmful? I think mainly 3 reasons why. One, simply because you detach from physical conversation. Because oftentimes when you see a lot of these kind of trends, you look to these trends for closure. This in turn means that you look to social media for closure, right? So for example, you oftentimes, when you feel like you have depression, you oftentimes just scroll through these reels. You look at the different experiences that people have instead of actively talking to people about their experiences. The reason why this is harmful is because physical interaction actually allows you to understand more about yourself, right? So for example, if I feel like I'm really depressed today and I talk to Janet about it, I probably am going to get some advice from her because she knows what I'm going through. She actually has the kind of connection with me that social media reels do not have with me, right? I think the reason why this is important is because you no longer turn to your friends and family. You turn to a screen that cannot have to you, I think this in itself actively worsens the team's mental health. But the second reason why this is harmful is because you have constant doubt in yourself. Because when you actively look on these social media contents and you see that, oh, maybe I have depression, because when you look at the real, you have 4 out of 6 signs of depression. I think oftentimes this means that you're going to constantly doubt yourself because in your teenager stage, you do not have a complete hope of like your identity. You oftentimes tie your identity to these kind of contents you look at. This means that you're going to create a constant doubt in yourself. But the third reason why this is harmful is because the inherent nature of popularity is that you want to attract attention from people. Oftentimes this means that contents aiming for popularity often look like generalizations or exaggerations of these kind of social media content. This means that when you often look at these social media contents, the contents are often like misdiagnoses of like these kind of mental health issues, but also untrue information that aren't there to grab your attention. The overall implication of this argument is that these teenagers are going to feel actively worse, right? Because the reason why you went to social media in the first place is to look for culture, but what these teens actually get at last is, for example, an effective closure, right? Because you didn't have actual connection with people, you're unable to talk about your feelings. But secondly, it also means that you're going to create constant doubt in yourself due to these kind of misinformations and exaggerations. But then onto my second argument on why we think the glorification of that oftentimes exists on these social media contents is harmful. Firstly, I'm going to frame why glorification exists. One is simply because content creators profit out of people watching content, right? This means that the content are going to say things that are more positive. I think this oftentimes leads to glorification because you do not actively want to see yourself knowing that you're gonna suffer from depression tomorrow. But I think two layers under this argument. One on why it's completely wrong to glorify these things. Because the reason why is because mental health deserves legitimate attention, right? Oftentimes this means you need to look at legitimate content from doctors or more formal sources in order for you to actually understand what you're going on about. But secondly, because it causes active time to Google for all these reasons that I was so proud to propose.
Alright, speaker, so for 6 minutes and 13 seconds, I thank the first speaker of proposition, and I call upon the first operator.
Teenagers and what's happening actually around the society, and it's already the mental health problem. Now, the claim about targeting audience, but struggling teenagers are the most likely to experience mental health problems, right? Because we also frame that teenagers are the one and the biggest stakeholder in TikTok. Because TikTok is one of the most influential platforms for teenagers to get information, right? So teenagers are the most vulnerable stakeholders in this case. And that most likely, they're the ones who are most likely to face mental problems. And most of the people use TikTok as their main platform to get information. And reels like Facebook and different kinds of platforms like YouTube will get information or reels from TikTok. So we play that and we frame that TikTok has a really big influential problem. And there's a claim about people will have doubt in themselves, but it's okay to doubt yourself about mental problem, right? It's always better because at least you acknowledge something and at least you try to go find help. It's good if you really have the knowledge of finding something and you'll at least have the opportunity to try and help yourself. And it's just don't have to force yourself to suffer from other mental illness. And it doesn't matter if you don't go to find. It doesn't matter if you're doubting yourselves because compared to having actively worse, it's at least it's better than suffering from depression, right? And it doesn't matter if you actually don't have mental problem or not, because you simply lose nothing. Even though you don't have mental problem, you lose nothing, right? But at least people who really have mental problem can try to find a way to help themselves and at least have the ability to empower themselves and to promote mental problems. We can't just simply assume that mental problem is fake, but we assume that and they're assuming that people don't have these problems. But the fact is that a lot of people have it, right? And we also claim that the stakeholders in TikTok is teenagers. And teenagers are the biggest popularity and the most vulnerable one who's going to be affected in this case. And you also talked about later. You also claimed about misinformation. But the point is that I think we assume that raising awareness will decrease information, right? Because more people will at least get into opportunity to try to understand what mental problems are, and more government and more school will be putting budget into it so that more people will at least know about what's happening around the world and what does like mental problem look like. So I think in this case, misinformation will be decreased. Now moving on to our argument about awareness. Because in the past, people don't know what mental illness is, right? There'll be stereotypes and lack of knowledge about what depression or what anxiety is. For example, in the past, people don't know what anxiety is, right? If you're nervous about everything or panicking or everything, people or doctors cannot get to help you, and they'll just assume that you're lazy or you're just, being weak. And people cannot help themselves, and it will lead to even more consequences because it will only exacerbate your mental problem, right? For example, another example for depression, people think they are just lazy, but the truth is that they're suffering from mental problem, right? And at least we claim that it's at least better to exaggerate but not doing nothing, right? It's better at least to know something rather than ignoring the things that are happening. And nowadays, like more people will get to know about depression and more people will get to know about what's happening, and so that people can try to find a way to help themselves later and to find a way to help others as well. I'll take that away.
Why is it that every roadside house, when you see a 30-second reel about, depression, that people will actually take action?
We've heard about exposure rate, right? There's a lot of reels and a lot of information on TikTok, and especially we think that TikTok is the biggest platform for you to get information, right? So with these kind of reels, there'll be more people to acknowledge what it is. But compared to the past, people don't have these big 30 minutes of reels. They just don't know what mental problem is. So at least in our place, at least in our house, we have more ways and more access to acknowledging what mental problem is, right? Later on, people with disorder can be seen and get more help, right? We also bring about awareness, and people will be like acknowledging and something like that. It leads to policy change because people. The government will care about the people in the bottom, right? So they'll put more budget in policy changes in curing mental problem. Like in the past, people cannot reach any access to help themselves, and even if there are few mental doctors in the society, they'll be afraid because of stereotypes. Like I just gave you the examples. And the second layer about people taking it seriously. Before its popularity, society was more unwilling to accept because of misunderstanding, and for example, having mental problems simply means that you're weak, right? So that people with disorder, they'll find a community. People don't have to suffer alone. Like in their family or friends that are abusive and toxic, but they can find community online. Otherwise, being alone with the illness can lead to even more dangerous consequences. In the very view that people will win, with disorders can find their community that I just mentioned before, and it's also important because it impacts very big, right? We also argue that even if TikTok's the most popularity who use TikTok is teenagers, but mental problem is not a case just for teenagers, right? All ages will have the opportunity or have the chance to get mental problem, right? But with more awareness, then more people will be affected, not just about teenagers, so that more people will be benefited in our site. I'm honored to propose.
All right, thank the reader. Opposition and call upon the deputy criteria.
I think it is true that both sides agree that mental health is an actual issue. But the problem with side opposition is they fail to prove the link between why the popularity is able to actually lead to making people feel better when they suffer from mental health. There's a few things I want to do in this speech. First, on one key piece of clarification, and second, I want to answer the three fundamental questions of this debate. First, as to why they cannot access the benefits they claim under their side of the house. The second, as to why there's actually massive harm associated with this entire thing, which I'm going to integrate rebuttals within. And third, as to why these harms tend to outweigh their benefits. But I want to first clarify that the reason as to why there are mental health issues in the first place is because there are actual issues that happened in real life. Things, for example, like the death of a family member, or peer pressure that you actually have to often go through in life, is the reason as to why, for example, you have mental health issues. The implication of this then is that the metric is which side is able to decrease the impact of these issues on your mental health in this debate. But I think I want to note on one thing, and it's the fact that oftentimes people already have a rise in people already seek support systems in the status quo. For example, going to friends, for example, or going to families, or going to therapists under our side of the house. The difference then is that the moment in which you resort to TikTok or resort to the 30 seconds of pain relief is the moment in which you actually have less capacity to go to other support systems under their side of the house. I want to first go through why they don't have any benefits under their side of the house. The first thing they say is that, oh, you're going to feel more secure because people now have seen that they have a community that they can feel reassured in. I think I want to first note that this community is extremely, extremely short-term because other than the 30 seconds you view the reel from, which is you only enjoy the 30 seconds of community you see on Instagram, the second you go off, TikTok, the second you go off TikTok is the moment in which you still feel plagued by all the troubles in life. You still feel troubled by all the things in life that actually plague you. Because the reels on TikTok presumably are not going to solve the issues like the death of a family member, for example. But second, I want to actually argue that you actually feel worse off because it is an active reminder that you yourself are going through depression. Because me, when I want to go on TikTok, I want to go on to watch, for example, funny videos to make me laugh to a certain extent. But the moment in which I know that these reels are also reminding me that I'm also going through depression, then that's a very bad thing because I'm not solving anything, but you're making me feel worse. But I think the third is that in the vast majority of cases, people tend not to go on TikTok to have therapy. People tend to go to friends, go to families to have therapy, for example. No, they have to explain as to why that additional TikTok reel is the revolutionizing point to the point where people are actually going to feel much better. The second thing they said is that there's going to be more awareness among the community, and that's why they accept this. I want to flip this argument on their side of the house. Moving on to the second question of this debate, why then is this extremely harmful? I'll take you later. No, because it is directly because of the direct rise in popularity of these mental health issues on media. That leads to the rise of anti-mental health narratives that exist in social media. What does this look like? This looks like, for example, the moment in which you make this a very extremely common issue in the status quo, more speakers are going to go on all sorts of platforms, not only TikTok, and say, look at how depression is so common in the status quo. And this is no longer an actual issue because a lot of people are just faking depression nowadays. This is extremely bad for two reasons. The first is that now people think mental health is not a serious thing anymore because now people think that, anyone who's suffering from a breakup is suffering from depression, and that's actually something very common, and I don't think that's a very serious thing. Or two, people think mental health is fake. I'll take you later, which is very bad because you take away the capacity to which support systems can actually help you. Because me now, as a friend who thinks depression is fake, I'm less likely willing to think that your depression is real and less likely to support you mentally. I think this impact can manifest in a few ways. For example, people tend to seek less help from external support systems, like therapists, for example, because they're now convinced by other rising narratives that these mental health issues are not actually as supportive. This directly flips the opposition claim, because what they're trying to tell us is that it increases awareness. But it's unclear to me as to why this awareness is actually quite important, when originally under our side of the house, people already have the capacity to seek help from friends and family. But the moment in which you actually tell us that mental health is a very, very serious issue, in every single instance, in every single 30-second reel I see, then people are not going to say, no, depression is actually not real. ADHD actually not as actually serious. And that means that people are less likely going to support them if you take away this particular supportive system. Before 5 years.
Let's go on to your point of saying how people don't go on social media to find counseling. Majority of teenagers who have mental health disorders don't actually know that they have mental health disorders. So if they see on TikTok the popularity of this content, wouldn't they be forced to doubt themselves and think that if they do have this
Absolutely untrue. I think you entrench them in a vicious cycle where they can only resort to 30 seconds of pain relief on TikTok. Because if I see a TikTok reel and I'm depressed and I say, I'm very depressed, right? But I tend not to have the motivation to actually go to a therapist on your side of the house. And actually, when I go on TikTok and I see all the rising narratives that, oh no, your depression is not real. Oh no, your depression is actually fake. I'm actually more likely going to get the consequence that you actually want to talk about on your side of the house. So third question then in this debate as to why the harms outweigh the benefits. I want to just lay this on simply, with a comparison. Where on our side of the house, people tend to already go to friends or families for therapy because people have depression or people know that they're sad. But under their side of the house, the moment in which you actually have this massive media popularity to make people think this is bad, then this is the moment in which support systems are actually less likely to help you. And this is the exact reason why I'm so proud to propose the motion. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition here.
The core thing you need to remember in today's debate is that you shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good. We'd argue that the popularity of mental health content actually has dramatic benefits compared to the harms. I'll first talk about my arguments and then add another layer towards our side and then move on to my opponents. First, on our argument of saying how people with disorders will be more likely to reach out and be more aware of their harms. They just try to tell you that there's going to be a short-term relief of 30 seconds, but they fundamentally misunderstand our argument. Our argument is saying that people who watch these reels feel like they might have signs of depression and will therefore be obliged to go reach out. If we don't have this, the alternative is them not knowing about it at all until it's too late and then the symptoms become too severe. We'd argue first knowing that you have these symptoms is far more important than compared to other things like misinformation. And we have empirical examples of this. For example, the Jeremy Zucker campaign on TikTok or the Heartstopper campaign all promoted better mental health resources to help other people. These resources saved thousands of teenagers' lives. It is because of this popularity that allowed for real lives to be saved. But even then, their second thing is that people go on TikTok to have fun. We'd argue that you can still go onto TikTok to find relief and find resources. It's not mutually exclusive, and even then, most teenagers don't know they have disorders anyways. But even then, let's add another layer to this argument. We'd argue that when more people are aware of mental health and all of its effects, they are more likely to go change policies. For example, all of these young voters will be voting for candidates that will make better mental health policies. They will be forcing schools to have even more. Be forcing schools to have even more policies. The fact that this year international schools saw a wave of new mental health legislation because of teenage advocacy points to you that current advocacy on TikTok is working. Yes.
If I go through an actual issue in life that makes me actually sad, how am I not aware of the fact that I'm sad?
Right, we'd argue that if you look towards the academic journals that actually talk to you about this topic, majority of people don't know they have symptoms until it's too late. Even in school, when you learn about mental health classes, you are taught that most people are not aware and they have to have a really big realization, and that realization happens on TikTok because they are negligent towards their own symptoms. Their only thing that's close to this is saying how the normalization of mental health is even worse, but we argue it's that this normalization leads to mental health change. The alternative is no discussion about mental health at all, and that is on that worse because people do not realize the harms of mental health disorders. But even then, let's look towards my opponent's side of the argument. The first thing that they tell you is that there's going to be glorification and misinformation, but this is very problematic insofar as most of the influencers that are actually talking about mental health are sharing their real, authentic experiences. My opponents, by saying that this is glorifying, is very problematic as they are demeaning the experiences of other people. They should not be able to judge the experiences of others. Therefore, you should not even look towards their argument on glorification. The second thing that they talk about is how people are going to doubt themselves. And that's even worse. However, there's several problems with this. First is that no one is actively seeking out to have more formal content. They say newspapers, could you guys be a little bit more quieter? They see that newspapers and other formal pieces of content are better, but we'd argue teenagers aren't actively looking up mental health symptoms or going to newspapers to find these resources. Teenagers are on TikTok, the spotlight, and where they get all of their information. That's why it's so key to use this as a tool to share more for better resources. Many people don't know these formal contents even exist in the first place. The second problem with their argument on misinformation and people doubting themselves is that public backlash already solves. The public is very critical of someone faking their mental health disorder. You see this example, for example, with Khloe Kardashian. When Khloe Kardashian was faking OCD, everyone called her out for it, and in that led to even more discourse on OCD and all of these other disorders. We'd argue discussion is mandatory for progress to continue. But even then, onto their second argument of saying how we're actively harming people through glorification, however, and saying how we're detaching people from physical conversation. The main problem with this argument is that people with disorders don't actively want to talk about it. People with depression, anxiety, and other disorders, one of the biggest symptoms is their reluctance to talk to others about it. Therefore, when they already have this symptom, the next best thing is to find a community online where they don't have to physically interact but can see other people are also going through the same thing. This on-net has already saved thousands of lives. But even then, their next argument is saying how can we be exaggerating and attention-seeking. However, we'd argue this argument is wrong for two main reasons. One, if people are seeing exaggerated content and start to doubt themselves, we argue doubting yourself is on net better because at least you're questioning whether or not you're in a good place in terms of your mental health right now, insofar as most teenagers are not aware of their own disorders before it's far too late. The second thing is that we argue friends and other people who see this content will be more likely to recognize the signs of depression and reach out to people who are struggling. This also saves lives. At the end of the day, we argue the most important thing is that having discussion is better than having no discussion at all. Whenever something's very popular, there will always be a group that's trying to take that away, but we'd argue that on net, the benefits still far outweigh. Thus, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. We are proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and call upon the third proposition speaker, Andrew Taylor.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Something that they get very wrong on their side is that social media is not the reason why we discuss mental health. The reason why we discuss mental health and the reason why we see researchers and we see families and we see friends having more awareness of mental health is because scientists and experts look to our world and say, why is it that in a world in which we have less social interaction, why is it then that more people feel sad? Why is it then that more people feel like they're struggling in life? That is the reason why we have these sorts of discussions. It is people who actually look into the statistics, people who actually look into the research of these things that are able to create discussion in our world. Social media is simply an add-on to all of that research that already exists in our world, and we see that that add-on has becoming extremely harmful in the world. So they're wrong to characterize that social media is the reason why we care about people's mental health, because note that Michael and Connie have already told you that when you have mental health, it is becoming increasingly likely that you're going to recognize that you're obviously sad, to recognize there's something that is obviously wrong with you. And that is the reason why people discuss mental health in the status quo. It is not social media like they say. So, now that I've established that social media is not something crucial to us talking about mental health, now I'm going to move on to my first class about misdiagnosis. So, we say that creating a large influx of people that suddenly think that they have mental health. Sure, it might be true that some people start to doubt themselves, but you have to recognize that the nature of popularity is not a way that goes like, oh, you should go seek help, you should go do something about it. No, it often glorifies and it often fetishizes people's sadness in order to make people feel good about themselves and feel good about their lives. Because people don't want to feel like they have to do something extra in their lives. They want to feel okay and complacent with what they are feeling. And we see that ultimately that leads to people not wanting to seek help on their side, because experts on our side will actually go to you and prove to you why help is far better. However, on their side, when they glorify characters, when they talk about certain narratives in which mental health is something that makes you complex, something that makes your life like very deep and poetic, that's simply not true on their side, and it causes a lot of harmful discussion that we see in the world today. But before I move on, yes, I'll keep it POI.
How can people know what the scientists said about mental health problems without a platform that offers this information?
Okay, it's because when you ultimately have like scientists caring about these problems, it likely means that these scientists have people who like support their research and people who are able to facilitate their work, right? What this ultimately means is that there's still going to be groups in the government that are willing to look into these types of things, and we also see that in the world today, like parents who are concerned that their child is like not happy and their child is not living a good life. Those are also probably people, and those are probably also reasons as to why people look into why they're sad. But especially because what Michael has told you already is that when you feel sad, you're likely going to want to look into it, right? Because you're seeing because you're seeing that there's something clearly wrong with your life, and therefore you're very likely to want to look into it. Secondly, we say that Connie has already characterized you why the nature of popularity makes productive discussions on their side very, very rare. Note that all of their positives come from the main point that all this discussion that is happening is something that is very constructive, is something that is very helpful. However, as long as we're able to prove that some of these discussions are unproductive and unhelpful, we can prove that that more harm happens on our side. Because when more people claim that they have mental health, it ultimately leads to all people who have mental health not being validated, and hence they're not able to help a single person on their side, because people are constantly going to have to think like, oh, is this diagnosis that I made for myself true? Or things like that, right? So the nature of popularity, what is that really? We say that the nature of popularity, when mental health is talked about in social media, it's made for a wide consumer base, right? It's made as a product instead of a research. We say that it is made as a product in order to be popular and in order to get as many people to engage as possible, because that's how social media content creators get money. And these so-called experts on their side, do you seriously think that a scientist or a doctor will be spending their time on being a social media guru instead of actually being a doctor or like actually being a scientist? We say that it's very unlikely that they have the time to do so. So the information on their side is likely going to be very incorrect, and it's going to all about be glorifying these sort of instances and glorifying the mental health that is happening on their side. And that is ultimately what is so and that is ultimately why the popularity, not the discussion of, but the popularity of mental health on social media is so harmful. They need to claim how even if this is even when the discussion is unproductive, why they're still able to win. Additionally, now onto awareness, right? We say that we say that they don't tell us why necessarily looking on Instagram is the tipping point for people to go seek out help. And that's a fatal issue on their side, because on our side we do tell you that when you have experts and when you talk to friends and family who actually care about you instead of strangers on social media, we said that when you talk about people that care about you, they're the people who are actually going to encourage you to go go seek help for yourself. Rather, on their side, these content creators, they only want you to be hooked onto their content. They only care about making money for themselves, and that's why ultimately on their side, these aren't the people that care about you. This isn't your real community. On our side, we enforce the importance of face-to-face and like talking to people about the issues that you're facing in your life, and that is why ultimately we are so proud to propose.
You guys know about 6 minutes and 19 seconds and then the third competition and call for the third competition. Yeah.
fundamental problem with the proposition side today is that they do not understand what a world without TikTok actually looks like, right? What do we tell you a world without TikTok looks like, right? We think because people fundamentally misunderstand mental health struggles. Like this is seen 20 years ago when mental health struggles was framed as mood swings, when anxiety was framed as just being nervous, right? People did not take mental health seriously prior to TikTok because there was no awareness about it, right? So when proposition tells you that research is already coming forward and giving you all these like accurate, correct information and data, the problem, the delta of this debate is that there's no awareness of this research, right? We say that TikTok and social media is a prerequisite to getting these meaningful discussions going, to actually have people become invested in mental health, to actually read these papers, because we guarantee you that the average individual does not read these research articles that they claim, right? And how do we help them today, right? We think that what the harm of the world without TikTok is that one, self-blame. Teenagers do not know that they fundamentally suffer from these mental health issues, even though they are the ones most susceptible to it due to peer pressure and just high pressure as a teenager in general when you're still navigating life, right? We think that it's very problematic. They say that you obviously know when you're sad, but we think that there's a very specific distinction between being nervous and having anxiety. There's a difference between being sad and being chronically depressed later. We think that in a world without TikTok, teenagers are likely to self-blame themselves for suffering from these things, self-blame themselves from not being motivated to go to school anymore, from suffering from all these problems. And we think that this is way more harmful because at worst, on their side, teenagers are a little lazier, right? Some teenagers give themselves a little more grace than they perhaps deserve, but we think that by avoiding worse outcomes such as self-harm, by avoiding worse outcomes such as suicide, this is still a net good. And on their answer on people seeking support in the stats, but we think that this is a problem because people do not have the resources, one, to support their friends in the stats when they're feeling depressed, because one, they don't understand what it feels like to be depressed because they haven't seen any representation in the media that they consume, and people also are likely to not believe their counterparts when they feel depressed because people will say that, oh, you're just sad, like you're not actually depressed. Before I move on to the second class, I'll take the point.
Per your own analysis, that there's a clear distinction between anxiety and nervousness. How is someone able to think they're nervous but not able to detect that they're anxious?
We think that one, like Dina has already stated, there's a lot of credible organizations currently pushing mental health awareness on TikTok, right? We do not think that the majority of mental health awareness content on TikTok is just influencers telling everyone that they're anxious. And next, even if all teenagers who are nervous believe that they're anxious, we think that this is still better than the alternative, right? Because at least they're willing to seek help, at least to prevent the harms from manifesting if there are harms. And we don't think that there's a real harm in more people seeking help because it actually increases awareness, right? It increases the amount of resources the government is willing to dedicate towards helping mental health. It increases the amount of voters that are invested in supporting mental health because it's seen as such a widespread problem, right? I'm going to move on to the second class. What does the content of TikTok actually look like? We think that it's more likely to be what Vina said, right? About these credible organizations, and it's more likely to have influence putting out the real struggles with mental health, right? Because as seen with Emma Chamberlain and other influencers, authenticity is very important in social media. Influencers are unlikely to romanticize their experience because being authentic generally gets people more views on social media in general. And messages are more likely to say it's okay to struggle, it's okay to have off days, it's okay to give yourself some grace. They're more likely to share these experiences. So we have three layers to this, right? One, individuals are more likely to realize that they need help, and they're more likely to have some support, even because in the stats right now, the problem is that even if teenagers do recognize that they have a problem, there's not a credible support system around them to help them, right? Because people, one, do not understand what mental health actually means, and two, schools and schools and communities are unlikely to help them because they also do not have the resources for this. And before I go on, I'll take the point.
If these are institutions making these posts on social media, then why would it be more popular, and why would they be any different from what is happening on our second, which is institutions making those articles?
The difference is that people do not consume those articles because people are predominantly using TikTok as a source for their information, which has been which we have explained down the bench, right? Now I'm going to give you a little rebuttal on desensitization, right? Because we think, one, the risks outweigh, right? Because even if you do not believe believe a random person on social media suffers from depression. You're more likely to believe that, for example, your sibling suffers from OCD from having so much knowledge, from understanding that it's a possibility that people suffer from mental health disorders, which does not happen in the opposition world. We think that this possibility makes people more likely to believe people, because you're fundamentally more likely to believe people you have close relationships with compared to an influencer. We think that even if there's backlash against influencers, that's not bad. And we think that if these posts are getting the public scrutiny that proposition says, then cancel culture and other things will likely make this argument a wash, because people will obviously fight back and have backlash. We gave it here an example of Khloe Kardashian. So we would just like to point out that we are the team who actually brings you tangible, widespread change, right? Because at worst, even if there's a world where too many people are claiming their mental health disorders, we think, one, it's unlikely because people understand the struggles that people with mental health disorders actually go through, and two, it's okay because this harm is short term. We're talking about the long-term benefits here, right? Where voters actually support mental health legislation, voters actually support funding for mental health. So even if TikTok is a short-term solution, it fundamentally builds up to a world where there's more education, more research, and more widespread knowledge about mental health, which is the only way to help struggling people in the first place. So for all these reasons, we're proud to
I thank the opposition to close the case for the op. We got one of the slides here.
There are four main areas where I'd like to address in today's reply speech. The first is whether or not social media is critical. They keep saying that social media isn't critical because there are other formal ways to get your research. However, again, as we argue, that doesn't make any sense insofar as regular people aren't going online to look for these critical pieces of information, have to go online. The second piece of clash that we need to address is whether awareness on TikTok versus formal content is more important. We argue that TikTok is always better insofar as people are always going to be going on TikTok to find all of their information, but what specifically breaks this clash is that they completely drop the analysis that professionals are going on TikTok and sharing their experiences, which means that we're still promoting positive information that is accurate. And insofar as we give you actual examples of professionals like Jeremy Zucker or the Heartstopper campaign going on TikTok and sharing all of their experiences, you know that this is a very probable argument. We give you examples of these campaigns saving thousands of lives while they fail to give you a single empiric of their arguments ever being true. But even then, the third main piece of clash that we need to address today is on policy change. They also never address this argument, which is that when more people are aware about social media, not only will they reach out more if they're struggling, they will also be more aware of the issues and vote for policymakers that are going to make even better legislation. The fact that this year we saw a huge wave of mental health legislation in several international schools in Asia proves that this advocacy is working. You see legislation and popularity working in a positive direction. This shows that voters are still supporting. And finally, on their argument of saying how the glorification and misinformation is bad, they drop two key pieces of analysis. One is that the glorification is wrong because they are not allowed to critique whether or not other people's mental health experiences are invalid. Insofar as they can't tell, that shows that it doesn't make any sense. And even then, professionals having backlash against all of these influencers that are faking disorders like OCD already solves back. But even then, let's move on to the weighing debate. There are two key places where we outweigh. Let's say both sides get 100% guarantee towards their argument. We still outweigh because one, we're more probable. We give you historical examples of thousands of lives being saved, while they don't give you any. You vote for us here because you know our impact is going to happen. The second place where we outweigh compared to theirs is scope. We are reaching far more people compared to their world in a world without TikTok, without the social media popularity, where many people who are too afraid to talk about their own symptoms can't find any relief in their own conditions. Insofar as we're seeing a lot of people, it doesn't matter if people get desensitized, insofar as the people who actually need exposure to this content still get exposed to this content. Insofar as we prove to you that we save lives and they only have their only impact of desensitization, you should not buy their arguments and focus on saving people who are actually struggling with mental health. Thus, we oppose.
And I call upon the top reflection in the debate here.
I first want to explain as to why our side already has a guaranteed level of benefit under our side. The first thing I want to say is that people probably know if something is wrong, and that probably leads them to, one, know that they probably have some level of symptoms already, or two, lead to them to go to actual doctors or professionals to know that they actually have some level of symptoms in this particular case. Per their own analysis, that there's a clear distinction between if you're just sad or if you're actually having depression, that I think if people can feel that they're sad, then presumably people are able to feel that they're actually depressed. And I think this probably means that they already have some level of idea that they need to seek help under our side of the house, and they already have these access in professional therapists or friends, etc. under our side of the house. But why is it extremely harmful under their side? And the first thing they actually say is that you get awareness under their side of the house. You feel like you increase the level of awareness in which people now accept mental health issues. I think the first thing is, this is probably untrue because we're talking about TikTok here. It's oftentimes a platform where social media influencers are the predominant majority when it comes to popularity, not very professional experts or scientists under their side of the house. I think this is extremely vague because that means under our side of the house, we also have access to the scientific studies that promote these discussions that they want to talk about when it comes to awareness. I think this is extremely detrimental to their case because that means that social media is not the reason as to why people are actually talking about these. But sure, social media does promote some discussion. So let's talk about the discussion that they actually promote. These looks like, for example, not professional articles being posted on TikTok, because TikTok are mostly for 30-second reels and videos that are more funny and more appealing to the average audience. These looks like, for example, social media influencers describing what they feel like when it comes to depression and making this extremely, extremely common. And this is unlikely going to be as scientifically academic as they want it to be. So let's talk about what exactly this awareness can bring when you involve social media. It often means that there's massive backlash. And that, sure, they responded to this by saying, oh, there's I forgot her first name, but like the Kardashian example, right? I think the Kardashian example literally proves our case. Because that means that people now show an aversion towards people who fake their mental health, and people think that people who fake their mental health is a very common problem in the status quo, like what Kardashian is doing in the status quo. And now people can say, look at Kardashian, she's faking OCD. What about the rest of the 99% of people who say they have OCD? Probably also fake, right? So now you increase the narrative, or you increase the narrative in which people are actually going to think, social media taught me, or TikTok taught me, that probably depression is not going to be real, ADHD is not going to be real, and now when you promote this awareness and this narrative throughout the entirety of society, you now actually decrease the capacity to which people can access the support systems that we originally have under our side of the house. So you can compare the support system that you actually have is, we have better friends, better professionals to help you, but they actually don't. So the actual thing that they only have is the pain relief they get from social media, but they never actually address as to why, for example, that 30-second of pain relief is actually going to solve any problem in the status quo, and for this reason, very proud to propose. Thank you.
Can you turn off the live stream? Are we going to do the live stream?
There's one person watching.
Who's watching? Thank the person for watching.
Thanks for watching, person.